Hello, everyone. My name is James Nicholas, and I'm a Senior Product Marketing Manager here at BioCatch. As part of Cybersecurity Awareness Month, we've put together a great conversation titled Taking Control of Zelle Fraud with Ken Palla and Seth Ruden. Today's conversation will be around scams, Zelle, person-to-person payment fraud, and much more. Please make sure you check out our white paper on Zelle fraud and the top 10 controls banks can deploy today to protect customers. If you have any questions, add them to the comments section and someone from our team will answer them live. And with that, I'd like to pass it to Ken Palla, an industry expert, consultant, and retired fraud director, as well as Seth Ruden, the Director of Global Advisory for Global Sales and Operations at BioCatch, for their brief introductions. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ken Palla. When I was at Union Bank from 2005 to 2019, I managed online security for both consumer and retail customers. So I was responsible for their security, looking at solutions, implementing solutions, and staying aware of the threat intelligence landscape.
Hi, I'm Seth Ruden. I am currently the Director of Advisory at North America for BioCatch and formerly the Head of Fraud Operations at First Tech Federal Credit Union. I have about 20 years in the space, have consulted with many organizations around the globe, and my primary focus is on controls, prevention, technology, and the process that supports it.
Excellent. Now that we've got the intros out of the way, let's jump right into it. The first question I have for Ken is, how are people getting burned by modern day scams?
So we look at it today. The FBI reported in 2021 that $3 billion was lost in cybercrime for consumers. So the number is large, it's growing, so it's very significant. What it includes are things like the romance scams, investment scams. A combination of romance and investment scams are called pig butchering. You also have scams where people are trying to impersonate the IRS, Social Security Administration, banks, P2P transactions like Zelle, we'll talk more about later, but a large number of scam activities translates to a large loss. And all these dollars are typically coming from the customer's bank account to be moved over to the fraudster one way or the other.
And Ken, do customers get reimbursed for these scam losses?
For the most part, they don't. So if you're talking about consumer, the romance scams, pig butchering, investment scams, things like that, there is no reimbursement. There is some reimbursement we're seeing now in what we call the impersonation scams on Zelle. And there was recently some discussions in Congress where a number of the bank CEOs came and talked about the economy as well as being asked questions on Zelle. And where we do see it, a much more broader reimbursement is over in the UK, where the UK does reimburse for more of the consumer scams, the romance scams, purchase scams, and things of that sort. And also, one of the things that's being proposed in the UK by the payment services regulator is that when there's a reimbursement, it should be split 50-50 between the sending bank and the receiving bank on these types of what they call authorized push payment scams. So that's kind of a new proposal that the PSR has in the UK right now for discussion.
Thanks for that, Ken. Now I'd like to pivot to a different scam that's taken the world by storm, that being person-to-person scams and fraud. So Seth, I'd like to ask you, what are some of the more recent P2P scams that have surprised you?
Well, yeah, the P2P side is pretty active. You know, it's been a wild ride in this space over the last few years. We started with some scams in the P2P space that were centered on impersonating fraud contact centers, where you would receive a text message or an outbound contact to suggest that there's a problem with your account. And these have been particularly problematic in the space for P2P and have demonstrated themselves to be really effective, unfortunately. And this has created a lot of copycat bad actors. And these guys have taken to this channel by storm. We had recognized quite a few different cells operating in a few different regions. And I think this is fairly well established as a global problem at this point. And, you know, so I see that there's a lot of impact and there's a lot of new entrants into this marketplace, and that these guys are very effective at this and have taken new derivatives to the table. And so one of those derivatives that's been particularly interesting is this pay yourself scam, where the fraudster contacts you and says, hey, we have this problem in your account and we need you to send the money back through the same channel that the money was sent out. And you initiate and authorize that scam to an email address that is being, in a very interesting social engineering capacity, suggesting that it's being sent to an email address that you may not have registered, but is purportedly in your possession. And people are doing this on the regular. So this becomes this authorized payment that you initiate on behalf of a fraudster, but of course they're at the other end of the email address and they're the receiving party for those funds. And at that point in time, you're on the hook as the consumer, as you were the one who initiated the payment.
And as a follow-up to Seth, what are some initial ways banks and FIs can help mitigate these P2P scams?
Well, it's all about controls, and it's all about having the right kind of controls enabled and deployed at times when you go live with these solutions. One of the most important things to do is to recognize that a fraud detection or prevention solution should be ready to go when the new channel goes live. And that's always the rule, always the golden rule. So very important to first and foremost put that into perspective. What I would suggest is that having decline controls available is one of those critical elements, and being able to set up those decline controls relative to some of the hallmarks of the scam creates for you an opportunity to be able to be resilient when the inevitable scams start to take place. So you need to start looking at specific elements that appear to be aligned to high-risk events. Some of those can be behavioral. Is the session looking like the fraudster is engaging with your customer at that very moment? Some of those can be relative to account takeover, where there's a new device entering the session, or that the session is taking place from a location that doesn't appear to be where your member has transacted previously. Some of those can be combinations of these, where you look at the endpoints, the networks, as well as the behavioral elements. And the recommended best approach is to look at all of these things in concert and have a sense of what are all of the risk indicators that could be associated with this thing. But this is only on the fraud detection technology side. And there are other ways that you can really put a lot of other preventative controls in place. And I think Ken's got some really great perspective on that.
Yeah, I'd like to hear your thoughts on controls as well. So Ken, any other controls that you are aware of?
Yeah, definitely, James, and thanks a lot. And one of the key things just to kind of bring out is Seth and I have been working over the past month to identify at least 10 critical controls that we think would add value to Zelle and other P2P transactions. And it's actually part of a white paper that will be coming out, I think, in the next week or two by BioCatch. But in looking at that, I'm going to call out a couple of the controls that I think are kind of unique. And the first one is, I think that when banks are doing the Zelle transactions and they see a high dollar transaction, and the amount can be identified by the bank, and there seems to be risk associated based on anomaly detection, there probably needs to be more delay of that transaction, maybe up to 4 hours. And the reason I say that is that a lot of these scams involve a phone call involving the fraudster talking to the customer and basically wrapping the customer's head around the scam such that they don't really understand what they're doing and they're just working at the direction of the scammer. And what you want to do is get that call to be terminated, and hopefully the customer realizes what just happened is all screwed up and they got to call the bank. By having the delay, the money will not have left yet. And again, if you do it based on risk, that's acceptable within the Zelle network definitions of when you can hold a transaction. So that's kind of one item. The second item is on the actual startup of Zelle. Most banks just include the Zelle product within the online. The customer didn't choose it, it's just there and it's active. There's a brief enrollment, but I think there needs to be more friction at that point, and also sensitivity that when Zelle is initiated for the first time, there again, if you see a higher dollar transaction, you probably want to hold that because this is important. Part of that also is maybe the customer might say, I'm using Zelle, but I'd like to delay everything by 4 hours. So give the customer some choice in how some of these controls get put in place. Another thing that I look at is the fact that we see there's an SMS message that's sent. So a smishing message comes to the customer. The customer is asked, have you done this transaction? $2,000. They check no. Next thing they get is a phishing call. It's a targeted spear phishing call to the customer. And then they start to initiate the scam, but over the phone. So what I want to do is I want to work with the telco companies and I want to work with vendors in the telco space to basically see how we eliminate this attack vector of the smishing and phishing that is so integral to these Zelle transactions. And in fact, I'm seeing some solutions in that space where there are companies paying attention to this telco area, including the FCC, which recently came out with some recent, I wouldn't call it regulation, but proposals to put more controls on these smishing messages where the telco companies can block the smishing message at the network level, which is what they've also proposed previously for the telephone calls. So I think there's a lot of opportunity in that telco space, but it takes active involvement of the banks as well as the telcos to make it happen. This isn't going to happen by itself, but I'm positive in what I'm seeing going on there.
Thanks for that, Ken. So switching gears a little bit, here at BioCatch, we've noticed that mules are used to help scam operations go unnoticed. How important is it to detect these fraudsters before the money is moved?
Well, it's pretty critical, as a matter of fact. What we've discovered is that in the last 3 years in the pandemic, we've seen a massive influx of high risk money mule related activity. The pandemic and subsequent massive fraud losses associated with stimulus payments that went out created some very significant opportunities for fraudsters to establish mule accounts that allow them to funnel those funds to their desired destinations. So there's always a precursor crime to necessitating money movement or money laundering. And that precursor crime in many cases is fraud. So having those money mules available and having them at the ready is something that allows these fraudsters to navigate these illicit funds to their desired destinations. So if you eliminate one of these areas where the fraudsters can be effective in creating and structuring a high risk money movement and exfiltration of those funds, then you're essentially taking away the cheese. You're making the fraud pattern far less easily executed. And so identifying accounts that have had evidence of high risk money mule kind of activity, where you can identify that a account has been sold or that a bad actor has acquired access to an account becomes far more valuable in making your organization more resilient against this kind of activity. And no one wants to be the place where the money gets washed. No one wants to have that level of culpability. And there's some regulatory consequences that can occur if that begins to be observed, especially by your BSA team. So there is a really strong incentive for you to want to acquire visibility to money mule activity and to be sure that you have additional controls in place that allow you to mitigate that kind of illicit account behavior.
Thanks for that, Seth. Ken, I'd also like to hear your thoughts on how important it is for banks to identify these mule accounts and also take action.
It's extremely important. I agree with what Seth said. I think the money mule accounts are really out of control. There's way too many money mule accounts, and that facilitates all these scams that we're talking about. And so we really have to pay attention to them. To me, the best example is on the commercial side of banking. There's been a lot of attention over the years paid to outbound wires and outbound ACH. And they look at the anomalies, they look at the volume, all the different types of things that are unique about those transactions. And when they see problems, they'll hold the transactions, they'll call the customer, they'll still make sure they can get the wires and ACH out in time. That same approach has to be applied to the inbound demand deposit accounts and things like that, because that's the money going in. If you're seeing, multiple high dollar amounts going into one account, why is that going on? Now, maybe it's reasonable that there's $2,000 or $3,000 accounts from many people going into one account, because the pattern might show this is an owner of an apartment building and they're getting payments that way from Zelle, as an example. So again, look at the anomaly detection. But James, it's just so important. And I think with what I mentioned before in England, where the PSR is talking about possibly coming up with a way when there is reimbursement for scams, it's split between the sending and the receiving bank on a 50-50 basis. If you get that kind of penalty, if you will, I think that will also force people to pay attention. But my view is simple. Commercially reasonable security should have us protecting these inbound accounts that become money mule accounts, and we should be doing the anomaly detection. It is money laundering, so the whole thing of BSA, AML should also be a part of this. And we, as the financial institutions in the United States, need to be much more aggressive in identifying and killing these money mules. And to credit, some of the larger banks have money mule attack teams. They're units of people, and this is what they do for a living. And more financial institutions need to do that. That's my point, James. A little bit strong, but I'm a firm believer that's how you stop this, is you kill the money mule accounts.
So Ken, on the topic of impact that banks, FIs, and their customers are seeing, what are your thoughts on the recent fraud loss numbers that are coming to light?
Well, so one example, if we go back to Zelle, in the month of September, Early Warning Services, which is the owner of the Zelle network, came out with a press report, and they were talking about the fact that, actually, they were very excited about the fact that they'd had a large volume of activity in Zelle over the past 5 years. And in fact, 99.9% of the transactions were the proper transactions, clean, and so on. But I took the other side of the coin and I said, okay, so that's 0.1% had a problem. It could be fraud or it could be a scam. Two different types of things, whether it's an unauthorized transaction or an authorized transaction, but that's 0.1%. And that turns out to be 1.5 billion over a 5-year period. So if you look at that and say, let's just say half of it are scams, that means customers using Zelle lost $750 million over a 5-year period. Now, again, those are approximate numbers, but even if you cut them in half or whatever, it's still significant. So those are the kind of statistics that we're seeing just on Zelle alone. Now, if you move over to other P2P like the Venmo, Cash App, and so on, you have it going on there as well. So the statistics are showing that the fraudsters are just getting better and better. And I know Seth's going to talk more about social engineering, but that's the cause. Social engineering is the reason there are losses in the online. It used to be malware. We used to talk about Zeus and NIMAIM and all these technical things. It's now come down to basically people, and they're being smart through psychology to con the US customers out of billions of dollars every year. So the stats I gave you are just that one number, just tied to Zelle alone.
Thanks for that, Ken. I think that's a good lead into our next topic. So now that we've addressed fraud, scams, and some impacts at a high level, let's talk about how complex social engineers are and how they can pry on the emotional hooks of their victims. Seth, what is your take?
Oh man, it was really illuminating to hear some of those initial calls when I was able to get those recordings. And what it demonstrated to me is that the social engineers, let's call them the attackers, were engaging with our members online and through various channels, through SMS, sending them text messages to tell them that there was a problem with their accounts, or via phishing emails, or with voice calls. They were terribly effective at being able to convince and compel the victims that there was a problem with their account, or that they were going to be liable for a loss, or that the government was potentially coming after them with a illegal activity that was perceived. These bad actors, these attackers, they are well-versed in the way that contact centers operate. They're well-versed in the ways that we authenticate with our customers. They're well-versed in the ways that they can change a perspective on how somebody has a concern about the legitimacy of the call and redirect to a piece of evidence that demonstrates that there is an air of legitimacy. So if I contact you and I start telling you that you've got this high risk transaction on your account and that we need to resolve it now, and I say I want to authenticate you with a text message that has a code, that is something that we do in the industry today. And that's something that we're very commonly aware as a practice that exists. Well, what if that code is not intended for that purpose? What if that code is intended to reset a online banking password? That becomes a point of vulnerability instead of a point of authentication. And that's the nature of how these social engineers are approaching our customers. And they may have already the information necessary to authenticate you by saying, your birthday is this, your social security number is that, your address is this, your card number is this. And I'm calling from a phone number that looks like it's the phone number for your institution. They're able to spoof that. And because they have this talk track, which demonstrates an air of legitimacy, authenticity, and they're able to speak in a way that lends itself to how our contact centers actually operate, it makes it sound as if these contacts are very likely to be legitimate. And as a direct result of that, we find ourselves having a battle to create the necessary elements that reflect what is actually legitimate in our operations. And I think probably we'll talk a little bit about best practices in education and all this later in the discussion. But essentially, if you can compel a victim to believe that they are at risk or they have the potential of financial loss or legal action taken against them, or even that if they don't take an action at this very moment, that the attacker who spent so much time with them coaching on the call, that the attacker could be at risk, that the individual who is being socially manipulated has a sympathy for that attacker or recognizes that they need to perform a specific action, they'll frequently take that bait. It's this escalation of commitment in the call that the victim finds themselves in that creates a sense of alignment to the attacker. And in listening to the calls, I've found that these attackers are very effective at demonstrating and creating that legitimacy within these sessions, that it's made them repeatedly successful and at a very high rate. So it's really a question of not will the social engineers be effective? It's a question of what's the likelihood that they'll be effective repeatedly? And is that are the economics in their favor at the rate that they need to be able to carry out these attacks continuously?
So, Seth, as you alluded to, if these guys are so good, what education can actually have an impact and drive awareness?
It's so important to make your customers and members aware of the potential ways that they will be compromised. Now, that can exist in a handful of capacities. First and foremost, you do want to ensure that you arm your customers with the necessary information to make them more resilient, because it's not going to just affect them at the bank. They could have, exposure through any vendor in any capacity. And it's really on us as gatekeepers of the financial ecosystem to be responsible and cognizant of the risks and be able to distribute that knowledge to the participants, our customers and members of the infrastructure. And I think it's pretty critical for us to demonstrate to all of those other parties who are stakeholders. That includes regulators and compliance and legal and all of these teams who ensure that we're performing in a responsible manner to show that we are also doing our due diligence in arming and protecting our customers as much as possible. So it's beyond just the capacity of we're going to reduce a member's or a customer specific susceptibility to the problem. It's about elevating their resilience and about creating the right kind of messages that say, we're here to help. We're a part of the solution, and that we want to be a stakeholder in your best outcome. And so it's best practice for us to help create that education, that awareness, and those campaigns, and do it in a way that engages those customers. And I love what Ken said a bit earlier about helping to benefit and elevate that awareness via psychology, via methods and mechanisms that help create that awareness and help break that cycle. And to be demonstrating and assisting our customers in realizing situations that are illegitimate and red flags to help them create that segmentation between a legitimate contact and one that's impersonating a legitimate approach.
Thanks for that, Seth. And Ken, I'd like to hear your thoughts on the same topic. So how important is it to drive awareness as well as be proactive in fighting fraud?
Well, it's clearly important to create the awareness, but the importance is to do it correctly. So when I think of education, there's one word I equate to education on these scams, and that's influence. And why do I say influence? This is what the fraudsters do, is when they're on the call with the customer, when they're sending the SMS message, they are influencing the customer. And especially on the call, they're influencing the customer to do this authorized payment transaction. The FIs need to do the same kind of influence, but for good. They need to have education that influences the customers to be aware of these events and not fall for them. Now, that's the challenge. And that's why in the white paper, we go into it a little bit more detail where we provide some sources of how you can understand some of the psychology going on, the concept of influence. But that's the education has to influence the customer to not do the scam. If the education doesn't influence the customer to not do the scam, I have to say it's worthless. Yes, people are doing it. The regulators require it. But if you're not affecting the behavior by influencing that behavior, you're wasting your time. Now, that's difficult to do. So I'm not saying it's a quick and easy thing. I'm not saying you go to your marketing department. You've really got to think about it as though you're a PhD in psychology and what is it you would do to affect this influence. So I kind of beat it quite hard there, but that's what has to happen or the education doesn't work.
Thanks for that, Ken. And to wrap this conversation up, I'd like to hear some final thoughts from both Ken and Seth on what should bank management do about this massive rise in scams as a whole.
So Seth and I have talked about this, and one of the things I'll give Seth credit for this is he came up with the concept of a consumer protection department. And both he and I agree that every financial institution should have a consumer protection department to address all these scams that are affecting customers, whether there's reimbursement or not. So whether it's a romance scam, whether it's a Zelle scam, the pig butchering scam, it's all taking money out of the customer's bank account. And so by having a department that focuses on this consumer protection, one, you can be much more aware of it and you can take better action, more controls to prevent customers from losing this money. When our customers in aggregate in the US ecosystem of banking lose $3 billion a year, that's a lot of money. And for these individual people, it might be their life savings. It might cause them to commit suicide. It's really a terrible effect, both financially and mentally for these people. That's point one. The second one is all financial institutions should track all of these consumer scams in detail so they understand what's happening to their customers. So again, not just the ones that are being reimbursed, but any scams that are being notified of the bank, because the money is coming out of the bank account. The customer is typically calling saying, I just sent $50,000 to somebody I thought I was in love with on the internet. Can you help me get the money back? Or I was just involved in a pig butchering scam, and over the last month, I sent $200,000 out. Can you help me get the money back? So the banks are getting these calls, but I think the tracking is very weak to non-existent. And that way, the banks will know the pain their customers are suffering, irregardless of reimbursement. And the third one is banks need to control money mule accounts. So all these things are really at the C level of financial institutions, and the C level needs to get involved if we're going to have a meaningful impact. Those are my points. Seth, what do you think?
That's very generous of you, and I think you're spot on with all of that. I have one other point that I've been harping on for years, and that is that there really is a way to create a strategy that allows financial institutions to differentiate themselves as a security-centric organization and to present that as a brand inherent element of that financial institution and make that public facing. If you can demonstrate that you are more advanced, more sophisticated, greater at detection and prevention, and will inevitably be a safer place for you as a consumer to store your money, then inevitably you're going to be able to attract individuals who recognize that distinction. And I think that using this as a marketing differentiator, a segmentation element, creates a likely drive for institutions to seek to align themselves better with a customer base who may need some additional assistance there. So yeah, the scam department is a real fun concept. And I think that an organization that looks at creating a set of ideals and putting behind that a set of technologies and processes that support them that are going to be efficient and leverage those practices that we all know in banking work, setting targets, great goals, having all of the right methodologies in place. These are going to be stronger drivers for a brand that wants to align themselves with successful outcomes for their customers in the end. And that organization is going to acquire a much more engaged customer base and one that aligns themselves to that organization's goals in the future. So there's an opportunity here, and that investment to capture market share will inevitably be a reward for an institution that pushes themselves down that pathway.
All right. Thank you, Seth and Ken, for your time today, and I look forward to future conversations.
Thank you, James.
Cheers, James. Thank you.